right, so here on example 1 is the question that we started in class today, and I'm just going to kind of go back over it. So I went ahead and I wrote out my inequalities, and then I included my select variables, and I went ahead and set it up into the select table. So then remember, we have to look in the bottom row, and we're going to find our biggest negative number. So that is the negative 60, which means this is going to be my pivot column. So then I have to find my pivot row. By doing that, we're going to take all of the numbers in the constant and we're going to divide them by these numbers here. So this first one we take is the 6,000 and you divide it by that 1 and we get 6,000. And then we're going to take the 40,500. We're going to divide it by that 9 and we get 4,500. And we're going to take the 5,250 and we're going to divide it by that 3/4, and that's going to give us 7,000. So to find your pivot row, you find the smallest of these three numbers, which is the 4,500. So that means this here now is going to be my pivot row. The one that's in both of the circles there is my pivot element. That's the element I've got to make be a 1. Sorry, guys. So to make that a 1, remember you're always going to multiply that row by its reciprocal. So I'm going to set up my next table, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rewrite rows 1, 3, and 4 because they're not going to change. Okay, so now I've got it set up where I've got rows 1, 3, and 4 recopied over, and I'm going to work on that row 2. And we said we're going to multiply row 2 by the reciprocal of that pivot element, so it's going to be 1 over 9. So let's multiply all of row 2 by 1 over 9. Okay, now that we've got that, all the other numbers in my pivot column have to become a 0. So these three numbers here are going to have to become a 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the row number, we're going to multiply it times whatever number I have circled in that row times row 2. So the only row that's not going to change is going to be row 2. So you might want to pause it and let's create our next table and only recopy row 2 right now, and then we'll do the work for rows 1, 3, and 4. Okay, so we got our table set up. We recopied our row 2. Now I want that first row, I want that first element there to become a 0. So we're going to take row 1 minus 1 times row 2. And I want, for the third row, I want that first number there to be a 0. So we're going to take row 1 minus the number that was there, 3/4, times row 2. And then the same thing for the fourth row. That should be row 3, sorry. Same thing for the fourth row. So I'm going to take row 4 minus the number that was there. It's a negative 60, so minus a negative actually makes it a plus 60 times row 2. So excuse me, let's pause while we find those numbers. Okay, so now we've got that pivot column taken care of. So now we're just going to repeat the process, and we're going to keep repeating this until I have no negative numbers in that bottom row. So I'm going to look at all these numbers here, and I see I still have a negative there. So that's going to become my pivot column again. So we're looking at this column, and now I need to find my pivot row. So remember, take each of these numbers and divide it by the element that's in that pivot column that's in that row. So 1,500 divided by 2/3, and we get 2,250. 4,500 divided by 1/3 should be 13,500. And then 1,875 divided by 3/4 should be 2,500. And so the smallest of those three numbers is the first one here. So this first row is going to become my pivot row for this next part. And so now we're just going to repeat everything that we were doing. We're going to rewrite our table. Remember now this 2/3 here is my pivot element. I need it to be a 1. So we're going to get that by multiplying that row by the reciprocal of that number. So let's pause and set up. Rows 2, 3, and 4 are not going to change. So I'm just going to set up my next table, but I'm going to have to erase some of this so that I have room to work. I'm going to leave this table here, erase all the others, and then start back up there at the top. Okay, so we got our next table set up here. Now remember, we want that pivot element there, that 2/3, to become a 1. So we're going to multiply row 1 by the reciprocal of 2/3, which is 3/2. So let's multiply every element that was in our row 1 in that other table that's showing by 3/2. Okay, so now we've got that done. Now remember, all the other numbers in that pivot column must be zeros. So these three numbers are going to have to become zeros, and we get that by taking that row that we're looking for and subtracting that number that's circled in that row, that element, times row 1, because that was our pivot row. All right, so I'm going to pause it. I'm going to set up my next table. My next table is going to have, of course, the lines, and I'll have the labels, and it's going to have row 1 only on it, and I will fill in the others as we go through it. All right, so for my second row, I need to make that 1/3 become a 0. So you're going to take row 2, because that's the one we're working in, minus 1/3 times the pivot row, which was row 1. For the third column, we need to make that 3/4 a 0. So you're going to take your row 3, because that's the one we're working at, minus the 3/4, that's what we're trying to get away, times the pivot row, which is row 1. And for row 4, we need to make that -20 into a 0. So you're going to take row 4 minus the -20, so it's going to make it a +20 times the pivot row, which is row 1. So let's pause it, work those numbers, and then we'll continue. All right, so, excuse me, we found those numbers. Now check out the bottom row again. Do you have any negatives? We don't. So, that means we're done. So we're looking for columns that have zeros and ones only. So notice in this column here, we have X, and we have a 1 right here. So that tells me that my X is going to be 3750. And then we have the next column there, we got Y with a 1 and all zeros. So that means my Y is going to be 2250. And the other one we're looking for here is our our profit, our maximum profit. Notice right there we got all zeros and the 1 for profit. And so that means that our profit is going to be the 315,000. And that's our max profit. And there we go.